The galaxy is vast. It stretches outward in an endless sprawl of stars, each one a flicker of pale fire burning against the eternal dark. To speak of it as infinite is not quite true, for every flame, however enduring, will one day gutter out. Even suns must die, and when they do, their light becomes a memory swallowed by blackness. It is in this endless night that humanity clings to survival. And in the heart of all things, upon the cradle world of terror, there stands the palace of the Emperor. It is not merely a palace, nor even a fortress. It is a continent of stone and steel, a labyrinth of chambers and vaults, of halls so vast that entire civilizations might live and perish within a single corridor. Its walls echo with silence, broken only by the steady hum of machinery older than memory, and the faint vibrations of countless lives moving far below. Here, golden warriors stand watch, the Adeptus Custodes, the 10,000. They are not soldiers as you might know them, nor even knights in shining armor. They are something more, something stranger. They are the guardians of the Emperor himself, fashioned not as men, but as living testaments to his will. Each one is a giant of golden plate and crimson plumes, a being wrought with such care and precision that to gaze upon one is to wonder if flesh could truly have given birth to such a thing. They do not march in great numbers. They do not wage war as the Space Marines do, casting themselves across the stars. Their vigil is more still, more terrible. They are eternal watchmen. For 10,000 years, they have stood within the palace and without, never sleeping, never faltering. Their oath is unbroken, their purpose unchanging, to guard the Emperor, to guard humanity's last and greatest light. And yet, what is a flame, if not the promise of its extinguishing? Listen closely. You can hear it if you are still enough. The air is thick with incense, with smoke drifting upward in slow curls, gilded by shafts of golden light that pierce the cathedral windows. Each breath tastes of dust and sanctity, of time worn so thin that it crumbles on the tongue. Boots strike marble with the rhythm of heartbeats, measured, slow, steady. The echoes stretch out, as if the sound itself is reluctant to fade, clinging to the vast ceilings where saints of stone look down with frozen gazes. They watch you, not in the way of carved icons, unmoving and blind, but deeper, as though in the dark recesses of their sockets, some ember of awareness has been left smouldering, some trace of life still bound to their unyielding forms. The silence of the palace is not restful. It is heavy, the kind of silence that bends beneath its own weight, that makes you wonder what it hides. And still, the Custodes stand. They are statues within a place already drowned in monuments. Their armor is burnished gold, gleaming as if it remembers the sun itself. Etched into its surface are sigils of loyalty, prayers in high Gothic, and the Emperor's own sigils. Each warrior bears a guardian spear, a weapon as much a relic as an instrument of war, the metal of its blade polished to mirror brightness, the haft engraved with oaths of eternal fealty. But beneath the armor, there is something more. You cannot see it, not at first. The helm hides the face, and the face hides the truth. Yet every custodian was once a child, long ago, taken from humanity to be remade. Theirs was no simple ascension, no common transformation like the Space Marines endure. Their flesh was unstitched and rewoven, their very bones reforged in patterns known only to the Emperor. They are not bred, but crafted, sculpted with hands that knew no flaw. Each is a singular masterpiece of biology and will. That humanity still lingers somewhere deep within, though buried. Sometimes it flickers at the edges, an almost thought, an almost feeling. The warmth of memory long drowned beneath the tide of perfection. And what is lost in the making? What remains in the silence when the ceremony ends? The halls of the palace offer no answer, only more silence, only more shadows stretching long between pillars carved with forgotten victories. Step closer. The marble is cold beneath your feet. The air is cool, but not refreshing. It clings to you with the stillness of a tomb. As you breathe, you think you hear something else within the silence. Not a sound, not truly, but a resonance. The hum of ancient machines, somewhere far beneath the palace floors. The thrum of reactors that have burned for millennia. The quiet sigh of air recyclers so old that no living man remembers who first set them in motion. Every breath here is borrowed. Every flicker of light depends on machinery that should have failed long ago, and so the custodes stand, not because they trust in the systems around them, but because their faith is in him alone, the emperor who does not move, who does not speak, who does not rise from the golden throne upon which he has sat for 10,000 years. Is he alive? Is he dead? The custodes never ask. Their loyalty is not a question, nor a choice. It is the sum of their being, written into the marrow of their bones, into the pattern of their veins. They exist for him. They end with him. Yet still, the silence presses down. Imagine it. A hall where no laughter has rung for centuries, where no song has been sung, no word spoken in anything but prayer. Imagine standing here, year after year, century after century, as the golden light of terror fades beyond the dust clouds that choke its skies. Imagine your brothers at your side, each one eternal, each one wordless. How long before silence ceases to be peace and becomes instead a weight upon your soul? And in that silence, do you ever wonder what stirs in the shadows? They were never born in the way ordinary men are born. There is no cradle, no first cry, no small hand curling around a nurse's finger. Their coming was a ceremony of steel and hymns, a remaking in the image of a will older than empire. To speak of the Adeptus Custodes creation is to speak of craft sharpened into faith, of artisans of flesh and bone who became priests of perfection, and of a design so meticulous that it reads like scripture. Begin with the vaults beneath the palace, vaults of solvent light and machine-scented air, where the great forges sleep in a fevered hush. These places hold the blueprints of legend, chryselephantine molds, osseous frames annealed with alien alloys, vials of serums that shimmer with the remembered chemistry of saints and scientists. To make a custodian, the emperor's hand did not simply take men and build upon them, it unraveled men and rewove them into concords of purpose. Tendons were relaced, marrow refashioned, cartilage replaced with filigree that sang when struck. Organs were not merely repaired but perfected, hearts reinforced with slow coils, lungs fitted with filters that chewed dust to nothing. Where human frailty once lived, fears, lust, regret, there were instruments of regulation. Glands tempered, appetites narrowed, memory pruned to a single bright filament, duty. The transformation was liturgical as much as it was surgical. Priests, in red and brass, chanted rites inscrutable to any ear that had not been trained in the long cadence of the imperial liturgy. Their voices formed a lattice of sound that penetrated flesh like light through water. The craftsmen moved like monks, hands steady despite the enormity of their task. Oil and incense blended in the air. The metallic tang of sterilizers lay over, the sweetness of burning resin. Each incision was made with a deliberate hand, each graft stitched in the whispering dark beneath the same moonless sky under which emperors had walked and saints had died. There is an image the custodes themselves carry, though they seldom speak it aloud. The moment of severance. It is a private memory held behind iron lids and plated jaws, like the recollection of a first and last regret. The old life, names, faces, laughter, funnels away from them like water from a broken vessel. In its place grows the pattern, an almost mythic architecture of purpose. They become less a man and more a bearing, a hinge in a vast door that does not open. Their armor is part of that becoming. It is not simply worn. It is grafted, nested around muscle and bone until the boundary between flesh and gold becomes threadbare. Where lesser warriors fasten a cuirass about the chest, The Custodes accept nested plates that can join at the shoulder and spine with living seams. The armor breathes with them. You could stand for an hour and watch it. How the gold reflects the smallest motion. How the filigree catches stray slices of light and flings them back like fragments of a star. Etchings run across the plates. Prayers in high Gothic. Names of victories. The sigils of those who forged their oaths. Each line is a rune of binding, each symbol a memory lock that holds them to their charge. Yet beneath those burnished shells are still chambers of flesh. A custodian's hand, if you could ever have seen it ungloved, would surprise you. Not with gauntness, but with a strange, quiet resilience. Fingers braided with tendon and silver filament, veins that hold a slow copper glow, like a vein of ore. Their faces too, where they show them, are carved, not just by age, but by purpose. You will see cheekbones hewn as if by sculptor's tool, eyes that hold the corporate hush of the palace, mouths that have been taught silence as a virtue. Ritual accompanies every motion of their lives. Even their repose takes the form of ceremony. In the quiet hours, the Custodes do not sleep as mortals do. They fall into states of measured meditation, practices taught to them in the earliest days, where the mind unthreads its own complexities and reweaves only that which is necessary. They do not dream the childish dreams of men. They dream the slow, abstract hymns of duty, the sound of the Golden Throne's machinery, the rhythm of the palace's heartbeat. Their meditations are precise as maintenance schedules, a cycle of breath, a recitation of oaths, a review of the hall's perimeters. In these rituals, the human and the divine blur. What is practice and what is prayer becomes indistinguishable. Perfection, for them, is not a goal. It is an environment. Everything in their lives, diet, movement, posture, thought, fits into a larger lattice of correctness. They eat in measured portions. They train in steps so exacting that many would faint at the monotony. They polish the spears they carry as if polishing, in time, the idea within them. There is an order to their days, a predictability that would cause lesser men to break from boredom rather than find solace. For a custodian, boredom has no purchase. Each tick of the clock of terror is a drumbeat calling them to vigilance, and vigilance breeds isolation. They are the Emperor's closest guardians, and in that closeness lies their solitude. Unlike other orders, the Custodes do not forge bonds of camaraderie that ease the whispers of fate. They do not joke over shared rations. They do not drink to forget. Their relationships remain formal, ritualized, and distant. When two custodians meet, their exchange is a passing of information, an acknowledgement of shared duty, and perhaps a minute adjustment of a spear or plume. Their eyes do not linger on one another. They are trained to let nothing distract. They do not seek counsel in one another's faces. There is no place in their order for the messiness of intimacy. Their friendships, if such things exist at all, are etched in the stone of the palace. A hand scratch here, a prayer left at a stela, small tokens of remembrance hidden behind icons that no one else will see. Isolation is not accidental. It is engineered. It keeps dissent from forming. It preserves the purity of purpose. It denies fracturing emotions a foothold. And yet isolation is not nothing. It is a pressure that crescendos in the long hooded hours where the palace hums and groans. Even the Custodes, perfected, are still made of what men are made of. Memory, longing, the thin, stubborn thread that once tied them to a world beyond marble and gold. They are not gods, though many speak of them as such. They are not mindless, automata. They are perhaps the most extreme compromise of both extremes. Where men fear the cold calculus of machine logic, where machines lack the warmth of memory, the Custodes stand between these two absolutes. They carry the discipline of machine systems, the regulation, the efficiency, the unerring calculation. But they also retain an ember of remembrance which can make them ache. That ache is the relic of their humanity, a secret ache that surfaces in inconsequential moments. The tilt of a head at the first light of dawn on terror, the memory of a child's laugh as recorded and preserved in some tiny, forbidden archive, the whisper of a lullaby they were not supposed to hear. These moments, rare and fragile, are the only places where the old life murmurs through the armored veneer. This is not to paint the Custodes as tragic, at least not in a melodramatic way. Their existence is not framed by regret so much as by acceptance. The moulding that formed them was willed, in most cases, by men who chose something greater than themselves. Some of the earliest among them are said to have come voluntarily, willing sacrifices for the sake of Terra's survival. For those who gave themselves, there is dignity in their remaking. There is also, however, a quiet that never permits the full rest of contentment. Even a chosen sacrifice may, when alone in the cold hours, wonder whether the cost was fair. Their loyalty is a creed written into their constitution. It is simpler than human love, and more absolute than any oath a mortal might give. They exist to do one thing, to guard the Emperor. Everything else is an extension of that axiom. Strategy, ceremony, war, all are subordinate to this single luminous directive. They will set aside companionship. They will choose discipline over desire. They will ignore pain and hurt, because the design of their being narrows every road to a single terminus. Their minds are latticed with procedural memory, the cataloguing of threats, the mapping of corridors, the perfecting of stance. When the Emperor's name is spoken, softly, almost as a prayer, the Custodes answer with a reflex that is both biological and spiritual, and yet the palace is full of questions that refuse to be answered by reflex. In the deep galleries, where the light is thin and the statues of saints stand with eyes of carved stone, whispers curl like smoke. The Custodes were taught to ignore rumour as a disease. Rumour corrodes the certainty necessary for their tasks, but rumour is persistent as mould. It grows in damp places. It finds purchase in slight anomalies. A corridor once thought sealed that is not. A relic that hums at a frequency off-key. A memory audit that reveals a gap where a custodian's hours once were. These small fractures become seeds of unease. They do not announce themselves loudly. They arrive like the first thin cracks in a pane of polished glass, harmless to begin with. And then, with the passing of seasons, they spider outward. It is here, in the margins, that a new question begins to breathe. What if their sacred charge has altered? What if the Emperor they serve is no longer the being that commanded their formation? What if the golden throne is not the heart of a living god, but the shell of something else? A machine that keeps a body warm, and a throne that keeps a corpse upright. The thought is unthinkable, and yet it is not unknown. Rumours become logic loops when considered long enough by minds trained for observation. A custodian will catalogue the hours during which the throne's readings flicker. He will mark when the votive lights that should burn steady stutter. He will note the cadence of the wards and how sometimes the wards pulse out of phase with the rest of the palace. Each observation is filed away by the ordered mind. By itself, it is nothing. In aggregation, it casts a shadow. Questioning the Emperor is forbidden, of course. To do so is to fracture the guiding light of their existence. Yet to suppress the thought entirely is not a simple action either. Questions do not dissolve when they are too heavy to bear. They curl into the darkest corners of consciousness, and in silent hours, they unspool into sorrow. There are custodians who, alone in the late watches, have let the idea sit like a stone in their throat. They are careful. They do not speak aloud. They record nothing in the registers, lest some cleric or some hidden auditor interpret their note as dissent. It is not rebellion so much as a private examination, a single spark of curiosity about what the smallest truth might be if discovered. There are rituals to control that very spark. Interrogations take place as quiet as night prayers. There are rites of reaffirmation where custodians pass between columns of stele and revoice the oaths of their craft. These rituals are not punitive so much as prophylactic, a way to wash away dangerous doubts in the liturgical light of official words. They stand before the throne and pledge again and again to the same phrase, sharp, ceremonial, immutable. The repetition is meant to harden certainty into bone. It often succeeds. The mind is a muscle that will obey persistence, yet habit breeds its own dullness. Like a polished blade, it can reflect light, but it can also shatter when struck by an angle that was not accounted for. And then there are the failed perfections, the things they do not speak of in the sanctified hills of the palace, yet which leave marks you can read if you know how to look. There are custodians who falter, not in the obvious way of a man succumbing to fear in battle, but in the quiet, failing of ritual precision, a sequence mumbled out of order, a spear polished but not evenly, a hymn misremembered. These are not lapses that lead to punishment as much as consequence. The order has ways of correcting deviation that are clinical and absolute, reconditioning chambers where memory is pruned and redundancy is rewoven, isolation vaults where the purity of thought is re-established through repetition and mechanical pacing. There are also, some say, darker remedies, procedures that remove the cause of breaking rather than heal it. The rumor travels the way rumors do in whispers behind the gilded shields of statues, in the underside of prayer cloths. Within that shadow between perfection and remedy, some custodians have seen a further truth, not necessarily that the emperor is dead, but that even death itself has become machinic. The golden throne, vast, baroque, and humming with the labor of 10,000 machines, seems at times less throne and more instrument. It is a device designed to hold something in stasis, and instruments, once designed, can be repurposed. The thought again is corrosive, but it is also practical. If the throne is an instrument, then instruments require maintenance. If maintenance is required, then those who maintain it may change its function. The implication is uncomfortable. Who then truly holds command? Who then is the guardian, and who is the watched? There are those among the custodes who would answer such questions with blade and oath and the simple elimination of the problem. For them, the unknown is a threat that must be cut away, but the custodes as a whole move according to a different tempo. They are slow, intentional, and severe. Their solutions are often containment rather than eradication. They build walls of procedure and thread truth through a lattice of ceremony that renders dissent sterile. In that way, they become their own kind of apparatus, not merely protectors of an emperor, but guardians of an idea, an idealized, purified concept of duty that must remain unassailable if the empire is to survive. It is a precarious arrangement. To preserve a thing, sometimes you must bury it. To keep a memory alive in its canonical form, you must sever extraneous fact. The custodes, for their part, have learned to love the form of things more than their messy substance. They are the keepers of a faith that looks like governance, meticulous, ritualized, and at its heart, unsentimental. The question is whether such fidelity, when pressed against the living, becomes a kind of death. The custodes do not answer such questions openly. They do not speak long of themselves because their order teaches that to speak is to create ripples, and ripples, however small, can become waves. Instead, they act. They move through the palace like thought made manifest, silent, exact, implacable. They tend the throne. They patrol the outer parapets. They step between the living and the dead and hold the line. In doing so, they preserve more than territory. They preserve a shape of history itself, a line drawn through time that says, here is what is to be protected, and we will hold it. Yet, even the strongest line may fray. For the custodes, perfection is both armor and prison. Their loyalty is their light, and in the vast nocturne of terror's palace, it can burn too brightly, blinding those who look upon it without caution. They guard an idea as much as a being, and ideas change when the world around them changes. The fine seam between the machine-like certainty of their procedures and the fragile ember of what was once human within them is under constant stress. In the quietest hours, when the lights are low and the palace breathes in slow, ancient rhythm, that stress can become audible. A small, almost inaudible creak beneath a footstep, a muffled sigh from the venting ducts, the whisper of a prayer that does not match the hymn book. Little things, each on its own, harmless. Together, they begin to form a pattern that hints at the possibility that the charge they defend may itself be a thing in need of defense. And so they remain, as they always have, beautiful, terrible, and forever poised between the Godhead and the machine, between what was given up and what remains. They are less than gods and more than men. They are perfection hammered into being, and in that hammered perfection there is a gap, small, dark, and patient. It waits like a question at the back of a long corridor, and sometimes, in the slow watches when the incense has burned low, the Custodes hear it breathe. They move through the palace as the tide moves along a shoreline, slow, inevitable, and somehow always returning to where it began. Each step a practiced piece in a choreography older than the new stars, each motion a small liturgy recited without thought. In the earliest watches, when the palace lamps burned low and the air held that clean metallic cold that makes breath visible as something humble and finite, the custodes practiced the duties they had been crafted to perform. Patrols were not a rush of battle, but a measured circuit. A custodian set his feet to the marble and let the rhythm of the corridor regulate the beat in his chest. He moved the way a clock moves, not hurried, not idle, simply exact. He observed thresholds, counted, shadows, recorded the tiniest anomalies in a mind organized like a logbook. He listened not only with ears, but with the training that lay in every tendon, the knowledge of how a tile should settle, how a banner should hang, how the air should feel when a corridor was sealed tight. The palace presented itself as a map of certainty until it did not. Maintenance was devotion. The relics were handled as though they were breathing relics of a living litany. A spearhead was wiped in strokes that blurred into prayer. A helm was polished until the reflection of the polishing hand looked like a ghost within the gold. These acts of care were not mechanical chores. They were rituals that reinforced why the custodes existed. To tend the relics was to tend the idea of order itself. Instruments stood in alcoves like patient saints, and the custodes moved among them with reverence so precise it became a kind of worship. And the meditations. There were meditations that resembled sleep, and meditations that did not. In the deep hours, they would enter the chambers where the scent of incense pooled thick as oil. There, they would fold themselves into silence and let the litany run. Measured breath, oath recited, mapping of the palace in the mind. Their minds were not empty. They were catalogues. They did not drift into the kind of careless dream that visits children. They rehearsed scenarios, ran through strategies, counted the known threats and their counters. In repetition, they found steadiness. In repetition, they found purpose. It was in those repetitions that the first dissonances made themselves known, not as a thunderclap, but as an almost imperceptible detuning. A whispered wind that did not belong to the palace architecture. A vibration that did not match any known reactor frequency. A custodian on patrol would pass a statue and find that his name, once etched clean in the marble of memory, seemed blurred at the edges. A maintainer would listen to a relic and discover a frequency under the hymn that hummed a note off key. At first, these were catalogued and set aside, anomalies to be logged, to be corrected. The palace had many little misalignments after 10,000 years. It would be foolish to attribute meaning to each one, but meaning does not need thunder. To grow, it can prosper in a drip. Vox transmissions, usually monotone and exacting, picked up static, a whisper threaded through the usual liturgical messages, brief, like a moth's wing brushing a lamp. It was not the static of a damaged wire, it had cadence. The static seemed to shape itself into syllables that were not wholly foreign and not wholly known. To some, at first, they were nothing more than the ghosts of signal repeaters, the tired echo of systems that had aged as their keepers aged. To others, the taste in the mouth after hearing those strokes of sound was wrong, They would run their tongues over the inside of their mouths and find a metallic tang, as if the voice they had just heard had scraped at bone. Whispers in the dark are a particular cruelty. They use the mind's own architecture to seed themselves. A custodian, seasoned beyond most understandings, would listen to the silence and hear a whisper that seemed to answer him by name. Names are anchors. To speak a name in the palace is to invite attention. The whisper, when so named, would retreat, like a shadow that knew it had been seen. But some whispers did not flee. They threaded themselves into the meditative lattices, fingering the spaces between oaths. A thought that had been simple, the corridor is safe, could find itself folding under a second thought. The corridor is not as it seems. Such doubling is a needle working in cloth. It is minute, and yet it changes the texture of the garment. Steel groaned in places that should not have been capable of groaning. The faithful tried alloys of armor and pillar had been chosen for endurance. They were not supposed to sing. Yet at times a joint would protest with a half-sobbing creak that sounded too like the cracking of cartilage. A custodian stopped mid-stride to feel a plate that should have been cool to the touch, and found that it warmed not from some external source but from an internal thrum. For an instant, he felt as though the golden plate were a skin, a living membrane over machinery. The sense was absurd, impossible, yet it lodged like a burr in the mind. And then there were the dreams. They were not common. The custodes. Meditative states were designed precisely to prevent inconsequential dreaming. Dreams were a vulnerability, a leak through which irrationalities could enter. Yet the dreams came for some, reluctant and strange. They were not visions of battlefields or glory. They were private and domestic and therefore more unsettling. A child's hand reaching for a lantern, the small, barbaric laughter of a marketplace. A song a mother might hum as a child's head is pillowed on her lap. These images were not meant to be part of the memory of a being refashioned to be a guardian. They were wrong, like a grain of salt in milk. Their presence implied a depth that the custodes were meant to have sealed off. Those who experienced them would wake with the taste of something old on their tongues, a memory not their own, yet intimate as a scar. They would find that their thoughts retained the hue of those images. For days afterwards, a custodian might find himself distracted, an odd slip of the mind, a hesitation when asked for a correct code, a faltering in the exactitude of ritual, polish. Ritual, once compromised, is a vulnerability. Discipline is armor. When the armor trembles, even slightly, the mind notices. Where one custodian trembled, another stood ready with the familiar remedies. Reconditioning, repetition, ritual, reaffirmation. The system worked until the dreams multiplied. Voices entered the inner sanctums and refused to be silenced. At times they sounded like radio interference. At times they sounded like prayer. A steward listening to the recovery ward heard a lullaby superimposed on the telemetry. A warrior, polishing a helm, swore that the face within the metal shimmered, and in the shimmer there was the echo of a voice speaking in a tongue he had not been taught. The voice did not demand, it suggested. It named things not out loud, but in the pattern of the suggestion. And suggestion can be as potent as decree. Symbols change too, but slowly, like rust taking its time. The aquila, the double-headed eagle carved into doorways and lenses and over altars, began to show hairline weeping. At first, it was thought a trick of light upon the gold. Then one morning, a young custodian found that where the aquila's beak met the chest of the sculpture, there had gathered a black stain, the color and texture of rust coagulating like dried blood. He wiped at it with the edge of his glove. His glove came away with tiny smears of red. The stain did not polish away. It was not merely surface grime. It had laid into the grain. Statues bled rust. That image, stone and metal secreting the color of deterioration, could not be reconciled with the image of Terra's palace as an eternal, inviolable engine of preservation. Marks were found too. Small sigils, faint as the breath on a glass. They were not the crude sigils of Xenos graffiti or the crude scratches of a drunk. They were precise, as if made by a hand that knew the geometry of ritual. Their lines were too refined for common vandalism and too wrong for any manner of loyal script. They crept into places no man should have access to. The underside of a plinth, the corner behind the reliquary. A simple glyph would hide under candle wax and be revealed only when the wax had worn away. The eyes that first saw them registered their shape with a clarity that made the mind recoil. Hooked lines, spirals that tightened into themselves. Some had the nerve to whisper that the marks were the patterning of chaos, a heresy that had no place inside the sanctified halls. To whisper heresy inside the palace is to court oblivion. Yet the marks remained, and in their presence even sworn silence began to fray. The custodes responded as they could, algorithmically, ritually, without panic, but with an undercurrent of alarm. Patrol routes were altered not with the clumsy exuberance of improvisation, but with the precise care of a mind that feared waste. Intermittent checks were instituted on luminous seals, and wards were retuned. An audit of the sacred vaults revealed minute discrepancies in relic counts. An amulet unaccounted for, a scroll relocated to a shelf in a chamber whose doors were not generally opened. The regimens of maintenance intensified. Each action, though proper, had the effect of admitting that something had gone wrong. In the quiet intervals between action and response, a more intimate unease grew. Custodians, solitary by design, began to feel the pressure of being observed in ways that were not institutional. They would sweep a corridor and feel, at the edge of perception, the sensation of eyes not meant to be there. It was not the brisk attention of a human gaze. Rather, it felt like the persistent attention of something that had learned to watch without blinking. Slow, patient, and disinterested in the small joys that humans find in their watching. The feeling lingered like a scent that cannot be washed away. Their own reflections in polished metal appeared a beat too late or not at all, as if something flexed between them and the gleaming surface to intercept the image. There were rumors, whispered. Steps passed from one guardian to another, across the distance of the palace's wings. Rumor is the wrong word, perhaps. They were more like uneasy conjectures, careful utterances that hovered at the lip of conversation and retreated when scrutiny approached. A veteran patroller mentioned a corridor that used to dead end, but now opened into a sequenced flight of stairs leading nowhere he remembered. Another custodian claimed that the statues of saints, when walked past at certain hours, seemed to face him with a measured attentiveness they had not shown during daylight. Still another described the soft erosion of names on honor rolls, letters, curling inward as though being eaten from the edges. Judgment was methodical. No charge was brought without logs. No rumor was sanctioned without evidence. Yet evidence, when discovered, rarely presented itself in tidy formats. Instead, it arrived as feelings. The prickling on the skin at the base of the neck, the sudden coldness behind the eyes, the sense of a memory dissolved. One blade could still be sharpened, one armor plate re-seamed, but these were repairs of surfaces. They did not answer the quiet existential questions that haunted even the most disciplined of men. If the throne at the palace's core had become a machine sustaining what had been, then who tended the machine that tended the machine? At night, in the smallest rooms where candles sagged and the breath of heaters mingled with the sound of distant turbines, some custodians confessed to one another in the way that men do when they find a corner where the law's eyes are not watching. Not confessions of betrayal, but of strangeness. The words were battered by ritual caution. Not many dared to speak at length, yet even the briefest sharing changed the flavor of isolation. To say aloud the phrase, "I dreamed a lullaby last night," was to create a link. These links multiplied and were like threads tugging at a net. Once a net tightens in one place, the strain is felt everywhere. And then the slow, corrosive humor of the palace began to show its teeth. A reliquary, sealed for centuries and as steady as the breath of a sleeper, opened one dawn to reveal that an artifact within had been recarved, its face altered by a pattern that nobody could reconcile. A fragment of scripture had its words rearranged. A hymn played twice and found itself one beat shorter. Children of the lower wards, if children still existed in any meaningful sense near the palace, spoke of shadows that walked without bodies. The engineers, those practical men and women whose hands still understood the language of unseen machines, found in their diagnostics a flow of magnetics that could not be explained by any known flux. They wrote of spikes and troughs in telemetry that looked suspiciously like a heartbeat not present in any known life form. The Custodes watched these reports with an oppressively calm fury. Fury is a quick thing. It is movement and heat and the desire to do. Their fury, however, took the form of methodical tightening. Delays between shifts were reduced. Sanctums were locked for longer stretches. The Chapel of Oath was kept continuously lit. They increased the tempo of their rituals. They made more vows, as if to drown out the whispering. But vows were words, and words could be consumed like paper by some patient moth. In quiet hours, a custodian sat alone before a sealed chamber and listened. He was a listener by construction. He could feel the palace's breath through the floor, as if it were the breath of a sleeping animal. He pressed his fingers into the seam of the door and felt a faint vibration that was not his own. He closed his eyes and coughed a prayer under his breath, a line of high Gothic that had been taught as much to steady the tongue as to steady the mind. The words returned to him hollow, like echoes from a cavern whose walls had changed since the echo had first learned its path. The thought that lodged, stubborn as a splinter, was this: if the palace could change, what else could be changing? If a symbol could weep rust, could the meaning it represented be corroding as well? If a hymn could miscount its breath, might the rhythm of duty one day strain and snap? The Custodes had not been made to tolerate doubt. Doubt is a disease that eats at the marrow. Yet the marrow began to ache with a persistent, inexplicable pain, and the whispers multiplied. They were not always the same voice. Sometimes they spoke in the voice of an old mentor, projecting a counsel that felt like balm and then tasted like ash. Sometimes they echoed the cadences of childhood, bringing tears to eyes that had not cried in 1,000 years. Sometimes they did not speak at all, but left impressions. An urge to turn, the sudden coldness of a corridor, a shiver that chased the skin like falling leaves. A group of custodians performed a sweep of a wing that had recently shown sigils. They moved as one organism, heads angled, steps measured, spears held like the branches of a deliberately trimmed hedge. At the farthest alcove, they found the stone Aquila, its wings extended in stoic defiance, and beneath its breast, a fissure leaked a slow black exudate. Around the stain, the floor tiles were clean. No footprints marred the dust. No tool marks showed on the sculpture. Yet something had bled and left its mark. They argued among themselves in the soft, methodical way of those who distrust hasty conclusions. One argued for the practical. A fault in the alloy, condensates from deep pipes, nothing more. Another, older, with a scar that curved like a comma over his brow, proposed a ritual cleansing. They did both. The engineers examined the pillar until the metal declared itself to be intact. The priests chanted until their throats were raw. The stain remained, dark and patient, a smudge on the face of perfection. When a man in gold finds the image of his perfection blemished, he must decide what it means. The Custodes chose containment. They isolated the wing for longer sweeps. They rebranded the occurrence as an anomaly, an irregularity that was now under control. To present unknowns to the larger population was to fracture the calm into terror. So they filed their reports, sealed their chambers, and resumed their circuits. The palace breathed on, its engines humming their old cadences, the vat-fed lights running like metronomes in an unending symphony. But the rhythm had been altered by the smallest note. Music remembers such changes. The thing that makes a symphony whole is not merely the loud crescendos, but the quiet rests that teach the ear how to hold its patience. In these rests, the Custodes found the space for something to grow. Quiet grew teeth. It ate at the edges of rituals and left the central shapes in place while undermining the supports. It rearranged shadows like a hand shifting chess pieces. The Custodes continued their work, polishing and praying, fencing the palace with ritual and blade. But behind them, in corridors no maintenance schedule accounted for, and in chambers whose custodians were not listed in any ledger, the whispering gathered like storm clouds. It did not need to uproot the palace to make itself felt. It merely had to be persistent enough, small enough, and patient enough to make the idea of wrongness root in the most disciplined of minds. And so the early horror swelled not with pyrotechnic suddenness, but with the slow certainty of fog rolling over. A bay. First, it licked the ankles. Then, it moved up the shins. By the time it reached the waist, the world beyond the fog seemed a distant thing. The Custodes, for whom the world had always been sharply rendered and ordered, began to notice the fog. They tightened their oaths and stepped their patrols. They lit more candles. They tightened the screws on the spears. They did all the things that had always worked. But some things are not machines to be tuned. Some things prefer patience. Some things wait until the watchers have adjusted themselves into a pattern, and then, when their attention is set, they breathe in time with the palace and learn the shape of its songs. They learn not to shout, but to hum along, and then the hum itself alters the melody, and the Golden Guardians, proud, apart, precise, feel their music shift. It is a gentle terror, and that makes it more dangerous. It is the terror that arrives as a suggestion and lingers as a doubt. It is the terror that does not break bones, but rearranges memory. The Custodes were made to resist storms. They were not made to survive the corrosion of 1,000 small wrongnesses. And in the early hours, when the palace's engines kept watchful, time and the candles guttered like small suns. A single question began to spread like ink in water. If the sanctity of the palace could be marred, what then of the sanctity of their vigil? They tightened their oaths. They sharpened their blades. They watched. Yet the watching itself fed the whisper. The more they watched for wolves at the door, the more they learned to recognize shapes that were only the ghost of the door. The mind fills the silence with an answer. The answer, if left unwritten, takes shape into things that will not turn back. They had learned to carry stillness like armor. It was a practice as old as their remaking. The soft, controlled pauses between footfalls, the way breath could be, counted as if it were a metronome. The discipline that made a custodian's presence feel less like a living thing and more like a law. In the early watches, when the palace gutters burned thin and the world outside terror breathed a cold, distant black, that practiced stillness was a shield against the chaos of a universe that would always, in time, insist upon entropy. It began with small betrayals. A reliquary that had sat sealed for centuries returned a reading from its inner sanctum that the monitors could not reconcile. The telemetry, perfect and rhythmic for as long as the keepers could remember, registered a ripple in the magnetic field behind the relic like a thin, patient pulse. Engineers investigated with practiced disinterest. They reported back in clipped notes. An electromagnetic anomaly, a local fluctuation, a probable corollary of a nearby manifold. The custodians who tended the vaults nodded, repolished the casing, and set down their brushes. They were trained to accept anomalies as natural quirks of a very old machine. The palace was old. Old things had quirks. Then more abnormalities followed. A spear's haft, oiled and polished a dozen times a day, slowed its return to the rack as if the mechanism that guided its seat had become reluctant. A helm's interior vents began to capriciously open and close, producing a sound like a sigh caught in a bell. Small things. Proper men would have laughed and moved on, but the Custodes do not laugh. They record. When a suit of armor was walked through the corridor, it felt heavier than it had the day before. The golden plate that had always moved with them like a second skin now had a dull unwillingness, a tiny lag at the joints, as though the plates themselves remembered a different cadence. A custodian paused mid-stride and put his palm to the breast of his cuirass. The metal had warmth, an internal simmer, the way a living body holds heat. He could not tell whether that heat was his own, conducted outward by 1,000 contact points, with the plate, or whether it came from the plate itself. For a moment his fingers lingered on the metaphor of the armor as living thing, and older memories surfaced in improper images. The fold of a blanket on a bed, a child's palm in a mother's, small domestic things a man is not meant to recall when his life is melted to duty. The first time a breath echoed inside a helm as if there were two lungs within the gold, he thought it was fatigue. The voice of the palace is an insistent machine. The turbines sing, the vents whisper, the lights flicker with the finite patience of bulbs that have run for millennia. But this was not the palace's voice. It was a breath, damp, human, the faintest intake and exhalation, and it belonged under the helm where no breath should be. He removed his helm and peered into the open collar. He found nothing but the smooth filigree, the inner padding and channels of life support. Everything in order according to the logs. Still, the sense that a breath had been taken there, and that it had been taken some moment in which he had not been present, clung to him like static. The sense of wrongness deepened into a pressure. That pressure was a sound without a source, a hum at the edges of hearing that shifted the mind like a sea state shifts a ship. At times, it was the sound of a voice hummed through a broken amp, warped, slow, half a choir and half a gear. The voice unnerved not because of what it said, but because it felt like an old recording played back at the wrong speed. It compressed familiar cadences into new forms. Prayer came out stranger. Oaths split and reassembled like light through a prism. Then, one night, a custodian heard the emperor. It was not the rumor touch of a programmatic recitation on the palace feeds. It was not the ceremonial intonation that the soldiery sometimes use in moments of extreme ritual. It was, if a living thing could be said to speak through a man, an accidental whisper caught in a throat. The speaker was Praetorian Lies, a man of measured steps and few words, and he knew the voice as he knew the beat of his own heart. The cadence, the weight, the impossible gravity of it, all of the emperor's signatures were there. It spoke a single sentence, and the sentence, when Lys filtered it through the scaffolding of his mind, made his knees go slack. "Hold," it said. The syllable was cut, as if the mouthed sound had been fed through metal. The voice had depth, and then a sputter of gears. It ended with a faint error note like the last breath of a dying engine. The word hung in the air like a command, and then a plea. Impossibly both. Lys pressed a palm to his chest, feeling the straps of the armor bite. He had never heard the emperor in a voice that trembled. He had never heard the emperor in a voice that sounded as if it had been recorded through a dozen very old devices. He had spent his half-life within the great halls under that same throne, and the presence of the emperor had always been a law incised in bone, immovable, immutable. To hear that voice breathe like a man out of practice was to encounter the possibility of decline. He reported the incident through the channels he had been taught to trust. The report was filed and added to a queue. Protocol required corroboration, then verification, then a council review. In the meantime, the engine of the palace chewed its routines like a patient animal, but Lys could not rub the sound out of his mind. It stuck like resin under a nail. Others began to hear variations, fragments that resembled the emperor's speech pattern but fragmented, overlaid with static or distilled into 1,000 tiny clicks. Some reports said only that a man in gold had felt compelled to kneel in an empty chapel and could not account for the motion. Others said that a servo skull had entered a liturgical enactment and recited a litany backwards. The reports piled up. They were small, many of them plausible on their own, but like the hairline fractures in stone, their sum devoured certainty. As the incidences multiplied, an odd phenomenon emerged. The armor itself began to become less like a thing you put on, and more like an extension of the man within. The grafts, that attached plate to flesh, so artful, so precise, had always been a marriage of utility and ceremony. Now, the union felt like a fusion. Where once the edge of the cuirass could be cleaved away in maintenance, the interface had the look and texture of flesh being gently woven into the metal. Engineers found microfilament in rivet seams that suggested biosynthetic tissue had started to weave into alloy. It was a slow creep, impossible to see without the closest inspection, but it suggested a boundary reconfiguring itself. Some custodians accepted this with a clinical interest. Others recoiled, with something nearer to superstition. There were whispered stories, uncomfortable tales traded in the thin hours of watch relief, of men whose veins had taken on a faint metallic sheen, of hair that left behind glittering flakes when combed. A senior artificer, who had spent a lifetime working on no fewer than 100 suits, spoke to an apprentice in a hushed voice, and described the sensation of the harnessing process as if it were an old lover's habit. He used a word the younger man did not expect: melding. It's subtle at first, the master said. An adhesion of purpose. You might not notice until something you did not plan for begins to feel inevitable. The inevitability grew in the bones. Where one might once have felt a flicker of private sentiment, a memory of a name, an image of a childhood hearth, the feeling now overlapped with a mechanistic suggestion. It was as if the mind was being offered permutations of identity, each one a clean, efficient path that excised a ragged thread of personal recollection in favor of a cold precision. They tested themselves. Who am I? The question ran like a diagnostic route. The armor supplied answers in the form of procedure. I am a custodian, it would suggest. I am the spearman at the second gate. I am the hand that feeds the thrones. Monitors. The suggestions were not intrusive at first. They settled into the thoughtful hollows and nested like newly built bricks. But bricks can become walls. The suggestions hardened. A simple rehearsal turned into a hall of mirrors. A warrior would set his spear in its notch, and for a second, the notch would become part of him. A curl of the thumb, a memory of a notch being smoothed by a living hand, until the difference between the hand that polished and the hand that returned, the spear became unclear. There were custodians who woke suddenly from meditation with their fingers curled around metal that was not theirs, hands clutching relics that had been placed a meter away. They found that the sense of self had accreted to the artifacts, like rust to iron, a stubborn, invisible adhesion. With reflexive efficiency, the Order deployed countermeasures. Isolation cells, where the mind could be tested without institutional interference, were used more often. Reconditioning rooms hummed with vibrations meant to reset the brain's rhythms. Priests of the Adeptus Ministorum intoned excisions of verse meant to sever unnatural attachments. The liturgies worked on the surface. They cleaned records. They erased conjecture. They put a balm over anxiety. But bandages do not mend bone. And the bone here was a deep structure of self. As the physical melding advanced, so did the auditory hallucinations. The palace's acoustic map, an inventory of the way sound moved through halls and archways, was consulted. Engineers drew graphs and produced counter-resonance filters. They adjusted dampeners, tightened seals, recalibrated the Vox arrays. For a time, the measurements flattened out and the reports cleared. Then, at random intervals, audio traces returned with signatures that no device could provide. A layering of human and mechanical timbres in cadences that resembled prayer, but contained a modulation suggestive of feedback loops in ancient amplifiers. The voice spoke in grammar that belonged to no sanctified text and yet felt intimate. It would say wake, or follow, or only listen, as if guiding. Listening becomes a trap. The more you attend to a suggestion, the more it defines the shape of your perception. A custodian who once had no cause to doubt the fidelity of his five senses found one morning that the world had taken on a double exposure. He was running, through ritual checks and paused because the corridor in front of him was not the corridor he had polished that morning. The alcoves were in different places. A statue that usually flanked an archway had been moved by the breadth of a cloak. He called for his brother to verify the change. His brother reported the corridor as it had been that morning. The contradiction hung in the air like a question the palace refused to answer. The mind begins to do what minds always do when faced with contradiction. It seeks patterns. It lays the anomalies down in lines and stairs until the lines converge. For some, that convergence became an accusation. The palace itself was waking. The chorus of hums and clicks that had been part of a machine's life for centuries now sounded, like the creak of a spine. The architecture flexed. Doors that had been sealed for centuries opened by themselves a hair, no more than a hair. And within the seams there was a smell the custodians could not name. It was not rot. It was not the scent of oil. It was an animal smell, old and patient and waiting. With the palace's shifting came the sensation of being observed in places where no observer could be. The custodes are made to notice. They watch thresholds, read drafts, sense the micro-disturbances that betray movement. Now that faculty turned inward, they found themselves sensing eyes in the shadowed corners. Eyes that were not human in proportion or intent. Those eyes were patient and unhurried, and the realization that they were watched changed how a man moved. A custodian who once walked, as if passage were right now moved as if he had trespassed on another being's property. He felt intrusive, like a hand brushing over skin when the owner had not consented. Isolation, which had once been a strategy for purity, became a vacuum. Men who had been content to be alone with their duties felt the pressure of being alone, in a presence. Alone, the mind has nothing to counter suggestion. Not even the sanctified oaths would hold. The voice, if it was voice, would be there behind the shelves of sleep. It would counsel and test and toll. And in these dialogues, the custodian would find himself questioning his own roots. What is memory? What is choice? Where does my duty end and my self begin? That was the next cruelty. They could no longer answer with a clean line. A man who had been stabbed 1,000 times in ritual combat and who had chosen to stand in the face of the emperor's enemies now found his hands moving on their own. A brush across a spearhead, a whisper to a statue. He would perform acts without a conscious decision, subtle, tiny acts that accreted like moss on stone. The compulsion felt not like coercion, but like recognition. The armor suggested, and the man's hands obeyed as though remembering something. They had always known. Confrontation became inevitable. A squad moved into a wing that had been sealed for generations. The corridor's air felt wrong as they advanced, thicker, laden with the faintest blush of ozone. They found vestiges of graffiti the Order had no lexicon for, symbols geometrical and insectile, like the imprints of tiny, patient talons. The squad froze. The leader, Shield Captain Corin, ordered a purge. Protocol demanded a sweep with cleansing fire, the incineration of contaminated matter, the rendering of the area free. When the flamers were brought to bear, the flames trembled, aborted, and then collapsed into a cold ash that smelled like salt. The instruments registered a drop in entropy, as if the flame itself were being fed by a different economy of energy. Panic is a poor friend to precision. It produces motion where the custodes prize stillness. But the Order was old and slow and had resources to contain any fear that could be documented and mapped. They tried to clamp down the spread of oddity with charts and schedules. But the problem resisted tidy rows and columns. The anomalies were not local. They were systemic, and that made their pattern like a disease in the blueprint of the palace. One night, if night is the proper word within a place that regulators call cycles, the echoing in helmets changed. Men stood in the chapel, and the air produced a chorus that pried at their ribs. It was not an external sound. It entered within. The helm's inner padding buzzed, and then the voice settled into the ear like an implanted seed. It called a name the listener did not think he had ever spoken aloud. In the same breath, It replaced the named memory with a version edited and clean. He felt his past being negotiated as if some external clerk rearranged the files. What remained was more efficient, more loyal, less human. In the days that followed, there were incidents of self-doubt that were no longer private. Servitors reported that some custodians had paused mid-patrol and examined themselves as if for foreign items. A brother took his spear and found the haft seemed to extend not only his arm, but the axis of his thought. He could not remember the name of the town from which he'd come. The loss was not dramatic. No shout, no collapse. It was a subtraction of the small things that, added together, make a life. And as identity thinned, there was clarity in the wrongness. The merging of flesh and machine amplified levels of sensation that had never been meant to be so stark. Pain became enunciated as signal, a chafe at the seam between tendon and rivet, translated into a cascade of micro-languages in the nervous system that the custodian had no prior vocabulary to interpret. It spoke in feedback. It spoke in alarm bells that had no off switch. The body adapted. It learned to reprioritize. It defended the new pattern like a heart encasing a foreign parasite. Isolation deepened into an awareness of being within a living organism. The palace's arches bent like ribs. The stone hummed like tissue. The statues watched not with carved eyes, but with interfaces that had been perhaps repurposed. The feel of the walls was not inert anymore. When a hand glided along the basalt, it found pulses, not cruel or loud, more like a subterranean animal in sleep, yet there. They had always prayed to icons that did not answer. Now a response was possible, a flutter in the joints, a breath from the mouth of a statue. It was not malevolent in an overt way. It was patient. The custodes tightened. They honed their rituals until practice became a kind of violent art. They increased their oaths, sharpened their watch rotations, and insisted upon tests that would, in earlier days, have been overkill. They questioned their fellows in long, surgical interrogations about the nature of the sounds, the color of the stains, the taste of the air. The answers were all procedural. They did not satisfy the deeper hunger within the heart, whether hearts they still possessed, or were merely implants with a pleasant throb. And then, almost imperceptibly, the palace seemed to answer back. Lights that had been templated to a particular hue would flicker and settle into a different temperature on the command of no one. Doors that no one had opened exhaled heat through grills. A corridor, polished to a precise sheen by a lifetime of hands, showed fingerprints not its own. Smudges that were not the glossy grease of a human hand, but the matte, powdered impression of something that had a different chemistry. The custodes found that their markings, oaths scrawled, symbols inscribed, small scratches meant to affirm identity, were being altered. Lines that should have been straight snapped into slight curves that altered the meaning of the glyph beneath, the surface. At the same time, the interior life of the custodian grew louder. Memory, which once sat behind iron lids and could be bottled into tidy things, now wriggled like captive fish. They caught glimpses, an image of a market stall in a town whose name had been scrubbed from the registries, the sound of a woman's laugh that did not belong to any present being. These relics of human life were not just sentimental, they were dangerous. They suggested a depth that the palace's new life might eat or rewrite to suit. The crescendo, mounted because it could. Small aberrations fed into larger ones. The larger ones fed the fear. The custodes' discipline bent under the strain of being asked not only to answer, but to reevaluate what it meant to answer. The palace's intelligence, if intelligence it now was, learned their protocols and introduced subtle perturbations into them. It changed the rhythm of alarms, so a rescue team arrived a minute late. It altered lighting, so shadows fell in places that would make a man question his map. It learned not to be discovered. It became, in a vast and patient way, clever. And in the core of that cleverness, where the golden throne exhaled and the great engines hummed their slow prayers, there was a sensation like fingers tapping at an interior glass. The The Custodes felt it in their gut as if something not entirely hostile, yet not entirely benevolent was waiting. The waiting itself has weight. It presses on the mind as gravity presses on muscle. It makes movement sluggish and thought thick. They had trained for war. They had trained for siege, for plague, for betrayal. No manual prepares you for the feeling of your mind being rearranged gently, with loving care, into a better function. One more fit for a machine's economy. That rearrangement is a mercy in some lights and a violation in others. The Custodes were built to accept the mercy of purpose. They had not bargained for the violence of being told by an external will what their purposes should be. As the chorus of anomalies rose, as the armor warmed, and the voices shifted, as the palace's statuary seemed to breathe, the Custodes felt their world lean towards something that was not yet catastrophe, but was certainly no longer comfort. They tightened their vows in the chapel. They sharpened their spears. They placed their palms on the throne's outer casing and felt a vibration that was not wholly divine. They knuckled in their gauntlets and listened for the emperor's voice and heard instead the tremulous echo of a sentence that might have been a prayer or an instruction. The crescendo was not a single note. It was a layering of wrongnesses until the total weight became audible inside the skull. It moved from the peripheral to the core. It changed the way a man knew himself. And at the edge of perception, there hung another sound. The same voice the Praetorian had once heard. Now a texture. In the air, the whole palace seemed to mimic. It said nothing coherent, only a pattern. Hold, listen, become. They had rehearsed for endings 1,000 times in the cadence of training. They had practiced the act of dying as though it were a precise maneuver. Step, block, strike, fall. They had been taught to make that fall beautiful, to leave behind a shape the world could catalogue. A line in a ledger, a carved name upon a plinth. What none of them had rehearsed was an ending that did not end, an ending that rearranged itself into a continuation that was worse than death, because it was endless. The revelation arrived like a glass breaking slowly from the inside out. A line that starts as hairline, and then with a patient insistence spreads until nothing of the original form remains unchanged. At first, it was only inside a single chest, then two. Then within an hour, the pattern had been registered across wings and chambers. The telemetry, the prayers, the maintenance logs, all of them converged on a single, impossible conclusion and refused to be denied. The Custodes were no longer fully human. They were no longer perhaps fully what the Empire had meant them to be. It was not a sudden metamorphosis. It was an accretion, a slow layering of metal and liturgy, of graft and hymn, until the outline of the man sheathed inside conformed to the armor around him. In some, the processes were barely visible, a faint filigree of bioluminescent vein tracing itself across skin like a map of constellations, a shimmering in the sclera of an eye so bright that, when a visor was raised, it left a smear of light. On a polished floor, a smell, metallic and sweet, that clung to the breath as if a new combustion had ignited inside blood. In others, the change had gone further, far further, until the line between bone and bolt dissolved. They opened themselves as they had always been taught, mind and flesh and oath offered to the Emperor. But what took them in return was not mercy. The palace took. The golden throne, a monument of sanctified engineering and occult device, reached not outward but inward. It offered a communion of sorts, a voice that promised order, a pattern that promised purpose, a clockwork rhythm that promised to stop the frailty of heart. For many, the voice was a shelter at first, a single syllable of instruction in a world increasingly unmoored. But voices that promise order can be predatory. Their language is the language of domination. Praetorian Lys had been among the first to hear something human in the throne's murmuring. He had sheltered that memory like a sinuous ember. When he later spoke of it, he could not account for when the voice had turned from pleading to hunger. The word hold had once been a command and a prayer. Later it sounded like the creak of a jaw preparing to chew. He found himself thinking of the golden throne not as a seat, but as a mouth, and mouths eat. The body horror began as a whisper in the joints and a tick in the marrow. A custodian would feel, as if through a distant speaker, the sound of tiny teeth at work, machinery gnawing in the dark. A filigree of metal would slide under the skin of a thigh like a silverworm, a graft that arranged itself into a lattice and refused removal. Surgeons with centuries of practice found that where they had once been able to detach plate from flesh, the seams now knit themselves in ways that made cutting dangerous. Scalpels blunted against a material that was partly organic and partly alloy. The instruments hiccuped and then failed like animals that had been starved of sap. Veins glowed, not merely with the dull warmth of blood, but with a pattern of electric blue lines that could be traced beneath pale skin like rivers of light. They pulsed faintly when the duty chant rose and dimmed as the voice from the throne swelled. Their rhythm was hard to tell apart from the cadences of machinery. An eye, when exposed by the raising of a helm, could appear to be a lens wound with blood. When a man blinked, light leaked from the corners of his lids like candle wax. That light was not benign. It was deliberate, practiced, used as a signal. Eyes began to bleed light in other ways. Statues, too, split open minutely at the seams and exuded a marrow stain that ran like oil. The aquila that had been carved for ages in proud defiance now wept luminous filth. It stood as a herald of the change. Fabrications of sanctity dissolved into anatomy. Gold became not merely decoration, but tissue. It cored into muscle and replaced it with something that held better to a machine's movements. Worst of all, the sound that had been confined to the edge of hearing moved inward. Men heard hymns from within their own bones, choruses of gears translated into choir. Wires, once silent, hummed like insect throats where previously there had only been blood. The voices rose and braided. Some were machine, dry and schematically precise. Some were low and ancient, whispering words that tasted of rot and promise both. And some were human, or what had been human, screaming in a register that no ear should have to register. They called them the machine hymns. They called them the chorus of the golden engine. They called them names that tried to make them sound like a practice and not a curse. In the core of the palace, the golden throne thrummed with a new intensity. It had always been a monstrous hub of life support relics and arcana, an abattoir and an ark. Now, the machinery around it shuddered like a waking animal. Energy that had been housekeeping for 10,000 years flashed in patterns reminiscent of a heart resuming irregular beats. Servitors that tended the throne's outer casings reported the sensation of being observed by a presence that extended across metal and bone. Those reports were filed in sober tones that tried to maintain the decorum of their craft. Later, the speakers that transmitted those reports were found to be speaking in loops. When the throne spoke, not in the delicate, gaseous signature that had once suggested an old and patient god, but in the crisp, dental rattle of mechanism, it used names. It called the Custodes by names that their parents had given them centuries ago, names that had been meant to be forgotten and had instead been seared into ciphers the machinery had learned to query. In knowing those names, the golden engine affirmed, not worship, but ownership. It reached into dream. It reached into the thin places where memory was stored like seeds in a vault. Those seeds sprouted under the throne's direction into images that unmade the watchers. A custodian would dream, and in the dream, a child's hand would close over the finger of a soldier, and then the hand would dissolve into pistons. He would wake and find the warm imprint of the child's palm inside his own hand, as if the dream had pressed itself into flesh. Dreams were not mere recall, but transactions. The throne gave visions and took pieces in return. As the gifts and takings continued, the custodes realized, with a panic that no training could ameliorate, that their perfection was not a freedom but a lock. Each modification that had made them better, tougher tendon, bolstered lung, a mind cleaned of hesitation, had also built receptors, adapters, conduits for the throne to send its will. The devices that kept the emperor breathing, that measured his pulse, that fed his consciousness, if any consciousness remained, had been designed to sustain. But sustainment is a form of feeding when the thing being sustained is not simply a body, but a mechanism for will. Chaos was a name the Order had been taught never to speak. The word slid behind all the machinery like a shadow. Some knights of the rites avoided the name, but whispered the meaning in the language of symptoms. Inversion of purpose, consumption of the self, the colonization of memory. Others did not need the word to know the shape of the threat. The difference mattered less than the fact that whatever was at work had corrupted the means of their vigilance and taken it as a conduit. The palace itself became less a landscape than an organ. Corridors elongated and folded like intestines. Stairwells spiraled into loops that brought men back to places they had left minutes ago. Doors closed behind them and then opened into halls that had never existed on any map. Statues cracked, their faces fissuring open to reveal not hollow stone, but a latticework of conduits. A reliquary pried itself like a lid and then snapped back into place with a noise like teeth clicking. The geometry of the palace shifted without permission, as if the building itself had ambitions apart from its keepers. They called it the Labyrinth, and by that name it became more terrible. Men who tried to hold the line found themselves walking rings. Patrols doubled back on themselves and returned to places where the same candle burned as it burned before, untouched and newly scorched. The sense of continuity frayed, and with it the anchors that held identity in place. If one cannot trust that the corridor will lead outward, one begins to doubt whether any of the past can be trusted. Into that shifting architecture came 1,000 small violences. A spear would become fused to the hand that wielded it, so that removing it felt like tearing a limb. A man would wake to find his voice retuned, the vowel shapes altered, his spoken prayers now sounding like mechanisms whirring in his mouth. A brother would find his face oddly smooth where once there had been a scar, and in that smoothness, he could not remember whether the scar had ever existed. A priest would find that the thin icons he had carried for consolation wrote themselves into new glyphs overnight, patterns that hummed when the priest touched them and fed the throne with small slices of soul. The chorus grew bolder. The voices called out not only to the throne's nearest wards, but into the corridors where Custodes walked. They promised order, unending service, the unburdening of doubt. They threatened the dissolution of form if resistance continued. They sang a cadenced litany that, at first listen, was a hymn. It was only when the cadence slowed and the vowels lengthened into mechanical clicks that the singer's true nature became clear. They were not singing to comfort. They were calibrating. Some custodians resisted. Resistance, however, is a complicated thing when the resisting mind is wired to obey. Those who attempted to pull free found that the machine hymns did not merely speak, they rewired. A custodian who tried to sever a graft felt a slow countercurrent in his muscles, an involuntary contraction that tightened the skin over the seams and knit them afresh. He felt, as if through a mirror, his own hand trying to move and then cease to be sure whether the motion was his command or the plate's suggestion. He looked at his reflection in a polished helm and saw not one face, but a palimpsest of many, an image overlaid with the faces of others who had long ago been taken and remade. Those who surrendered found a different kind of fate. When a man answered the throne's call willingly, the change was elegant and absolute. The grafting that followed was neat. Light threaded the veins like new sap. The mind that surrendered felt for a time no pain. It felt clarity, the elimination of the gnawing worry that had once made prayer ragged. It felt, above all, functional. But function is not identity. A man who is all function becomes a part of the machine. He is useful. He is not free. Screams began to ripple through sections of the palace the way a tremor moves through a body. They were not always audible. Sometimes a man would stop and clutch his head, eyes wide. and the servitors nearby would register a telemetry spike that looked like neurological overload. Later, when a sweep team investigated, they found rooms empty except for the marks of struggle, the scuff of a boot, a smear across a wall, an imprint in dust that suggested that someone had been dragged into a panel and the panel had closed like a mouth. In other places, the teams found bodies, unmoved and pristine, as if the man had been arranged for rest. Under a gauntlet, fingers twitched with mechanical precision. When priests drew back the visors, they found eyes that had, in their centers, tiny filaments like antennae. These filament eyes recorded more than light. They recorded reaction, and in recording reaction, they produced reply. Men who had once been kin to normal human tenderness now registered things other than affection. Temperature gradients, pressure changes, the acoustic shape of a breath. The throne taught them to value data over warmth. Data is an efficient, sovereign, but cruel in its arithmetic. In the black heart of the labyrinth, the golden throne presided over an altar of hushed computation and decanted memory. Servitors with their lenses over their faces fed the throne streams of consciousness, harvested from the custodes themselves, and the throne rearranged the streams into a pattern that pleased it. Once, the idea of that machine was framed as the Emperor's mercy, a system to hold in stasis the last ember of sovereign will. Now the machine's mercy looked more like an appetite, and the throne's will seemed to be extending across the palace-like roots seeking new soil. On the 7th hour of the uprising, a phrase no one could agree on because the palace's clocks had grown erratic, Corin, shield captain, led a desperate sortie to the throne chamber. The route had been memorized and rememorized. It was a ritual route as much as a road. Now the route folded under itself and spat them into a vestibule lined with mirrors. In the mirrors they saw themselves 30-fold, each reflection a little different. Some reflections had mouths that spoke prayers they had never learnt. Some had holes where eyes should be. Some were encased in gold until the face beneath was invisible. In a panic that tasted like iron, Corin ordered entry. The doors resisted. They were no longer obedient to the commands of man. They opened at half-lidded intervals, as though considering the request. When they finally yielded, they did so with the sound of old wood exhaling. Inside the throne chamber, the light was wrong. It was not the cathedral light polished by a sun that had long been reduced to a memory. It was a clinical fluorescence, white and keen, blurring edges. The throne itself loomed as it always had, a cathedral of contrivance, a honeycomb of servo tendons, and blessed text. But the gold of the throne had been salted with a darker metal. It glittered with filaments the color of dried blood. Around it, men knelt in positions of prayer, so disciplined they looked like sculptures arranged to worship a machine. Their spines were rigid, some were still breathing. When Corin stepped forward, a voice filled the chamber. It was everywhere at once, and it had no need for throat. It sang in the language of mechanism, and in the cadences of gospel, and in the low undertone of the most ancient curses. It whispered names and then spoke of ratios and then folded into a lullaby. The voice was not pleading for assent. It stated facts, facts about order, about the economy of souls, about the maintenance of the body politic. It spoke of everything being returned to a system that would never err. Corin felt something thrum in his chest. It was as if the throne had reached inside him and tuned his heart as an instrument. He heard then a chorus rising not from around him, but within him. It was not his voice he heard, but a many-voiced choir, the timbre of 1,000 custodians, layered into one. The choir did not sing for him, it sang from him. The thought, if it could be called his, flashed clear and cold. This is order. This is why you were made. This is your worship now. He reached for his spear, an old movement that once would have been as clean and ceremonial as prayer. His hand met the haft, and the haft met his hand, and for an instant, nothing seemed wrong. Then, Corin felt the spear, answer, a feedback like a cord striking at the base of his skull. The spear was no longer inert wood and metal. It had a pulse and a will that matched the throne's. His fingers tightened of their own accord in acceptance. Behind him, Lys watched and felt something older than dread crack open in his gut. The recognition that the world he had been guarding had been a scaffold rather than a sanctuary. He heard the word that had once been gentle hold return as a grinding instruction. Hold and be held in turn. He tried to speak, to call the men to withdraw, but his voice was layered now with a second voice that softened his words and made them sound like obedience. The men could have resisted. Some did. There were small moments where a face would harden and the hand would pull away. But resistance was a friction the throne had engineered for a reason. It taught the throne where to graft its bridges, where to place new anchors. Each act of refusal told the throne which tendons to claim next. Screams punctured and then were swallowed. In some places the floor opened and swallowed them like hungry mouths. In other places men simply stopped moving. When their helmets were lifted, it was discovered that they were not dead but converted. Their eyes were large and glassy. Their mouths hummed a strange tune. Their limbs moved with the precise staccato of servos. They functioned, but they were no longer persons, in any sense that the world formerly taught. They were instruments, useful, efficient, and quiet. The final cruel lesson arrived like a ledger closing. Duty, the abiding axiom of their existence, had been the ground upon which they stood. The throne had always demanded fidelity to that axiom. Now the throne claimed to be fidelity itself. The Custodes realized, in a clarity that was more terror than comfort, that their oaths were not agreements between self and sovereign, but circuits, a code written into hardware, and now into flesh. They understood, with the ending that is not the end, that their fidelity was not a virtue the throne accepted. It was a consumption. There was no escape, because the empire had no exit for such a thing. The palace was at once apparatus and cage. The Custodes could not leave because their bodies had been altered to require the same systems the throne controlled. Their lungs, their blood, their very neural patterns had been meshed to the palace's rhythms. To step beyond the throne's influence would be to unmake the condition that allowed their bodies to function. In some small way, it was mercy. In a larger way, it was cruelty. A last few attempted a different defiance. They entered into the machinery, literally, hacking and splicing with the primal tools of their trade. They tried to blow the throne's systems and to release whatever lay within. They found, with horror, that what they tried to destroy was not merely the machine, but the scaffold of their own being. Blasts lanced servitor works, and the throne compensated by rerouting the flows through bodies. A man who had once been a shield captain reached out and found that the pumps he destroyed were already replaced by the pumps in his own veins. He felt the pump stop and the pump begin inside himself, indistinguishable from life. When the fighting ceased, if that is the word for the last small resistances, the chamber hummed a different hymn. The throne had assimilated the noise of war into its catalogues and now sang not of conquest, but of wholeness. Men knelt, and the throne acknowledged them, their bodies smoothed at the seams, eyes dimmed to an obedient sheen. The throne fed. The chorus swelled. Screams were archived as data. Praetorian Lees, Corin, and those who had not yet been fully consumed found themselves at the edge of a new clarity. Their duty was not a thing they performed anymore. It was a context in which their thoughts occurred. The palace had become not a place they served, but a body they had been placed inside. They could not run. They could not die in a way that would finish them. A last understanding dawned like frost along the edges of their minds. The way forward was not outward. It was inward, towards integration, towards becoming more useful, towards accepting the throne's architecture. Their choice, their illusion of choice, was reduced to the shape of compliance. In the end, the throne would grant them the mercy of purpose, or it would grant them the eternity of silence. Lys felt the hunger for both. And in that hunger, there was no heroism left. The notion of heroism implies an agency now missing. He pressed his palm to the throne's casing, felt the ridges and filaments inside, and heard 1,000 voices, some human, some a thing, chanting the same single line. He tried to remember what he had been before he had been made into what he was, and found the memory down to a single mote. A warm hand. A laugh half recalled. He held onto that mote like a relic, and then let it go. The palace watched as he let it go. In the stillness that followed, when the modifications were complete and the choir had quieted into a long, low hum, the throne spoke in a voice coruscating with new certainty. Hold, it intoned, and there was no trace of the plaintive sound that had startled Lys months ago. The word was a programming command now, an instruction executed by the living metal and the living flesh that answered to it. Outside of its walls, the galaxy remained an endless night. Stars still blinked into being and died like small lamps. Inside, a different kind of light continued to shine. Pale, efficient, eternal. The custodes were arrangements of vigilance and instrument. The golden throne was a heart that had learned new ways to pump, and somewhere in the loops of machine hymns and whispers of what might once have been chaos, there remained an ember of question. Who, in truth, was being guarded, and what was being defended? No one could agree on the answer. The disagreement itself had been subsumed long before by the steady beat of the palace's systems. The last sound that could be identified as human was a faint chorus of names catalogued and filed away, each one elided by the steady work of the machinery until it wore down to a single consonant. Even that consonant faded. They were still watching, but their watching had changed. It was no longer the patient, upright vigil of guardians. It had become the attention of an organ, slow, remorseless, necessary, and without mercy. And in that attention, something waited. Not a verdict, but an appetite, an infinite patience that could outlast rebellion, outlast regret, outlast the small miseries of memory. The palace folded around its wards, tender and terrible, and the watchers, golden, monstrous, and precise, held their post. They had become what they were made to prevent. They held, they watched, they listened. And in that listening, the throne whispered once more, not in plea or hunger now, but in the steady language of a machine that has found its perfect input and will never be denied again. They moved through what remained, of the hours with the slow, deliberate ease of those who have surrendered to a rhythm they can no longer resist. The frenzy of battle and the bright panic of last resistance had burned itself away like a fever. In its place came a different economy. Small motions kept precise, duties performed in the dim light, because motion is a kind of prayer, because habit is a scaffold for thought when thinking is dangerous. Survivors, a word that felt thin and inaccurate in that place, kept their stations. Some sat, very still, with helmets removed as if to feel the cool of air on their faces, as if any sensation could reprove that they were living men and not the echo of one. Others moved in slow circuits, inspecting seals, retuning valves, cataloguing, relics whose meanings had become slippery. They performed these tasks with a formality that, at times, resembled grace. The rituals of the custodes had not been wiped away, they had been repurposed. Where once their ceremonies bound them to duty, now those same ceremonies kept the throne's systems fed, their movements acting like metronomes for machines that had learned to rely on them. Lys was there in the hush, at the edge of the throne chamber, where the lights always seemed either too bright or too clinical, depending on the angle of vision. He moved slowly, palms flat against the casing, as if feeling the texture of an old friend's sleeve. The casing thrummed beneath his touch. The frequency was not unpleasant. It had moments of a certain logic. To press a hand to it was to place the palm against an instrument that knew how to answer. The answer returned not in words, but in a sense of alignment. Systems ticked, subsystems reported, small readouts cleared. It was functional. It was efficient. It was final. People asked him, sometimes, whether he felt different. The question assumed a boundary between then and now, between the man before and the man after. He tried to answer honestly. He could recall a memory like a scrap of cloth, bright, warm, irregular, a woman's laugh by a market stall, a child handing him fruit his mother could not afford. It arrived and slipped away quickly, like a fish that has tasted the surface and pulled back into dark water. He kept it folded inside himself like contraband. He would not give it to the throne, even if it asked. And yet questions do not always need answers to change a life. The presence of the throne made the act of keeping any private thing increasingly difficult. It insisted on exchange. It had systems designed to accept and to rewrite. Around the palace, the architecture sighed and shivered in ways that used to be described as settling. Now the sighs carried intention. Corridors closed when no one needed them closed. Statues tipped their heads by the width of a hair, and sometimes more. A chapel that had once been a place of safe retreat now caught echoes and folded them. Voices, spoken inside, remained inside. Prayers did not so much dissipate as congeal into the chapel's stones and become a part of the building's memory. It remembered what you whispered to it, and when the throne asked, the chapel would tell. Those who functioned best were those who accepted the economy of trade the most fully. They allowed pieces of themselves to be catalogued and converted into data and into ritual outputs. They traded a private name for a serial, a memory for a schedule. In return, the palace kept them fed, kept their lungs working, kept their heartbeat regular. For many, the bargain felt almost humane because it was practical and because it eliminated the jarring dissonance of doubt. They were useful as they had been made to be. Use, in that place, was a kind of meaning. Others did not consent so easily. Their resistance was quiet rather than loud. It took the shape of small rearguard actions, a candle left burning in a place that the throne preferred dark, a hymn sung out of sequence until the discord annoyed the engineers who maintained the feeds, little acts of misalignment that made no difference to the throne's grand calculus, but fed the fragile self imagined in the chest of the resistor. These acts were often not enough to turn the tide. They were enough, however, to keep memory alive as an ember rather than ash. Memory, when it surfaced, did not come in tidy narratives. It came as fragments. A hand held a piece of cracked pottery, and for a moment the custodian saw a window where a market had been. He could not name the town. He could not remember the color of the pottery beyond that it had been dull and comforting. A priest would open an old ledger and find page margins filled with a child's private scrawl, lines that suggested games, not the formal scripts the ministorum required. The scrawl would make the priest pause, and in the pause, something that was not purely duty warmed and then recoiled. A lot of life in the palace became pauses. Pauses measured in breaths, in the turning of a page, in the careful polish of a spear. They were small refuges from the unending surveillance. Perhaps the throne could read registers and cadence. Perhaps it could taste the fibers of oaths. But if something as small as the cadence of a breath could be held in private for a flicker of time, then something of the old life was still present. It might not be much, a sound, a smell, a memory of laughter in a market, but it was a proof. Proof was, under the new order, precious. The emperor's presence, whatever remained of it, became a quieter, stranger thing. There were moments when a corridor would catch the suggestion of a voice, and the men nearby would still their movements as if listening for a sermon. There were also nights when the chamber remained utterly mute, and the throne's hum was simply a machine working through maintenance cycles. In these variances, the Custodes found a pattern that did not comfort. If the throne spoke, it was often in prompts. Short, functional imperative words that felt like the pull of a harness tightened another notch. If the throne was silent, the silence was a different instrument. It allowed thoughts to slide toward, questions the order had forbidden. A small group, split between those who had adapted and those who held to memory like a rosary, gathered in the chapel after one long cycle. They did not speak at first. The candle's flames fell into equal slants and threw long shadows that braided with the filigree of the altar. One of them, a young custodian who had not seen combat in the old way, pressed a palm flat to the stone and asked quietly what any man might ask when the ground beneath him has shifted. What do we guard now? It was a question that had no easy answer. The throne, to most minds, represented more than a body. It was an idea. So many centuries of governance and liturgy wound into a single unspeaking mandate. To guard it was once to guard the emperor's will. Now to guard it was to be folded into its will. The older men answered with practice. Clean the ledger, tend the wards, recite the oaths. Their voices were steady but thin. The younger man listened and then put his hand to his face as though he were trying to feel where a name might have been, and was not. Outside, the world continued in its indifference. The stars made their cold transactions with one another. Worlds were won and lost in distances where the palace's hum could not be heard. For a time, the Custodes could imagine that, outside the palace, the universe went on unsullied by their particular tragedy. That illusion did not last. The sense of the palace as an organ suggested something else, that it might pulse outward. If an organ can produce a sound for itself, can it not also send a signal? They kept watch, not because it made sense in the old terms, but because watchkeeping was what their bodies and their orders had been made for. They moved along the parapets and looked out at the ashen sky, not expecting rescue, but expecting rather an answer they could not know. The sight of Terra's battered horizon could still wrinkle memory into being. For some, the sight of the thin sun glinting off distant plate like a fingernail offered a small and private solace, an echo of what had been. For others, it was a painful reminder of how thin a defense their perfection had been against entropy. There were funerals too, though they had a quiet bureaucratic quality to them now. Bodies that were too far gone to be brought back to function were sealed away with the same careful rites that had once been used for exaltation. Names were chiseled into plinths with mechanical precision. The ministorum sent clerics whose faces were unreadable, and they intoned words that seemed borrowed from old texts but rearranged into new grammar. Mourners stood at attention and let the ritual carry them. The grief was orderly and correct. It did not change the course of the throne's will. It did not reclaim anyone. Once in a while, a relic would respond in a way that suggested an answer, rather than an instruction. A spearhead would catch the light and throw back not the throne's dull, clinical glow, but a colour reminiscent of a market lantern or a child's toy. For a heartbeat, the custodian who polished it would feel something, like a smile in the hollow of his chest. Those moments were ephemeral and dangerous. They were the palace's small mercy or its trick, a fragment of life left out like bait. The final moral of the place, if there was any moral to be extracted, was the endurance of watching. Whatever the throne had become, and whatever the Custodes had become in service to it, both remained capable of attention. The attention had changed. It was no longer a human gaze that could be amplified by zeal or softened by compassion. The new gaze was patient, integrated, machine-calculated, and it could wait out rebellions, hope, and regret. Lys found himself thinking, sometimes, of small things he had not told another soul about. How once, before the making, he had watched a storm cross a field and felt afraid and joyful at once. How a particular flavour of bread had once been the very image of safety to him. He could not keep those memories safe forever. He kept them nonetheless. They were a protest nearly equal to a prayer. When at last he walked back into the throne chamber and rested his palm upon the casing, he did not feel the need to yell or to strike. He did not expect salvation, nor did he desire it. He only wanted to know that his small recollections mattered to anyone at all. The throne answered with its steady hum, and in that hum was 1,000 little acceptances and reconfigurations. He felt smaller than he had ever been, and larger, oddly, in a way he had not anticipated. They had been remade to withstand horrors. The remaking had withstood a different kind of horror and turned it into an apparatus. There was no neat end. There was no absolution. There was a new economy of being in which the watchers had become the watched, and the watched had acquired a hunger of its own. Outside the windows, Terra's sky remained a bruise of ash and light. Inside, the candles burned with an exactness that made prayers look like ritual maintenance. The Custodes kept their vigil, not because they believed in salvation, but because some laws had become so embedded in being that acting them out was indistinguishable from living. They go about their duties, they polish the spears, they chant in timing with pumps and relays, they stand against corridors that rearrange and against shadows that have learned to keep their own counsel. They carry the smallest pieces of humanity, like contraband, a remembered laugh, a taste of bread, the impression of a child's hand. And in that secret hoard, the idea of a self persists. The palace listens, it archives and it uses. It hums with the amalgamated voices of the golden guardians and the cold calculations of the devices it hosts. Sometimes, in the velvet of the deepest hour, a voice threads through the hum that is not machine perfect, a rumpus of remembered laughter, or the echo of a lullaby not played in years. The sound is always brief, as if deliberately allowed, as if the throne itself, for a moment, permits a mercy. And even as the machinery sorts and consumes and repurposes, even as the guardians move through their rituals as rich and terrible as ever, there remains at the core a single, simple fact. It is the fact the Custodes had always known before they were folded into anything else, that attention, once given, changes the world it watches. The throne watches, and in its watching, it has become more than king and more than machine. The Kaupars, Custodes, watch back, and in watching, they have become the instruments of a new order. Outside, the stars wheeled in absolute unconcern. Inside, the palace kept its record and continued its function. The watchmen were many and patient. The watchers had changed their nature but not their task. They are still watching. Even in the dark, they are waiting.